In this video, we're going to look at and compare three different types of containers for mixing epoxy. We have a silicone container, a plastic container, and a paper cup. Now, you can buy actual paper containers that are specifically designed for epoxy, and if you do, you're guaranteed that there's not going to be any type of film or anything like that on the inside that might interfere or dissolve into your epoxy. So, if you are going to use a paper container, make sure that there's nothing in it that will dissolve or cause problems with your epoxy. So let's take a look first of all at the silicone container, and the nice thing about this is the cleanup. So I have one here that I've used recently, and everything just comes right off. The stirring stick comes out, and any leftover epoxy just comes right out of the container. So this is a really makes for easy cleanup, even along the edges. So anything here, you can bend this around, you can get all the epoxy off. It just all comes off. All these little pieces of epoxy just come right off. So it makes it, especially along the edges, it makes for really easy cleanup. Any of the fine film inside here just comes right out, and you're ready for using this container again. You do need to make sure that you get it completely clean. So what I like to do is, after I get all the big pieces out, I'll take it in to the kitchen sink and wash it out with some water and dry it out with a paper towel, because I don't want to leave any little pieces of epoxy left over inside there that would interfere with the next time I go to use this container, and then I've got little pieces of dried epoxy floating around in there. So the cleanup on this is really nice. One thing I found though, also the stirring stick, you just bend it back and forth a bit, and all of the epoxy comes off of this as well, so you can reuse all of this. One thing I found that's a little difficult to use with this is in stirring it. Because it's so flexible, the bowl kind of deforms in my hand as I'm trying to stir it. So I really have to make sure I hold it and get all of the corners and edges in there and turn it around. And even the bottom, I try to make sure that I get everything mixed up appropriately. And it's a little bit harder. I'm not sure if I ever have it fully mixed, so I end up over mixing it. And not that that's a bad thing. I tend to try to mix it underneath the air conditioner, so at least while I'm mixing it, it's keeping it cool. But you could end up spending more time mixing it because it's harder to make sure that you got everything. The other thing, when I go to pour this out, and I'm trying to scrape all the pieces, all the last drops of epoxy out, because it's so flexible, I find it's a little bit hard to get, every last drop of epoxy out of this container. So the downsides are mixing it's a little harder, and pouring it out is a little bit harder to get all the drops out, but cleanup on this is just amazing. Okay, so let's take a look at the plastic containers. And these are plastic containers that I get that have a mixing stick that is designed for this container. And I get these containers at West Marine. And the mixing stick has a rounded edge and a squared off edge. And the rounded edge, the radius of this rounded edge, matches the radius of the container. So when it goes time to mix, as this is mixing, I'm guaranteed that I'm getting every last little bit of epoxy hardener mixed in with the resin. And the bottom, the container's not deforming in my hands. So as I'm mixing it up, I find that I can mix it up a lot faster in these than I can with the silicone. And also when it comes time to pour, it's very easy to to tip this over and use the same container. And because it's a little bit, it's not as flexible, it's very easy to scrape every bit of epoxy off the edge and the top edge. You can get every last bit, every last drop of usable epoxy out of this and onto your work surface. The downside is the cleanup. So it's a little bit hard. You can squeeze this, but it's a little bit harder to get it all out. And I found that the edges here along the top edge are the hardest, especially with this little overhang to it. The epoxy gets up under there, and it's really hard to get that out. I mean, I could break a little bit of this off, I think. Maybe not. I hear some cracking, but it's kind of, I mean, it's really stuck on there. And I find that it's easy to crack the edge of this. If we take it and we try to bend it too much, then we crack the edge of the container, ends up cracking. So they are reusable, but I think they have probably a limited number of reuses before the container starts cracking. I do like the graduated measurements on here. I think these are very easy to read. So if you are measuring your epoxy and hardener by volume, then I think these are a lot easier to read than the graduated measurements on the silicone. There are some, but I mean, I can barely even read these, so I don't even know if it'll show up on the camera. But there are some markings on the side here. Very difficult to read. I would not try to measure this out and use these markings on the silicone versus the plastic container. I think they're very easy to read and lay those out. And I don't know, for me, I seem to trust these markings more than I would trust the silicone anyway. I'm not sure why, but that's just kind of how I feel. Okay, so all of these have been reusable so far. Even this stirring stick, the plastic stirring stick, you can bend it gently. Probably not as much bending as the silicone stirring stick, but this can be bent a bit and reused as well. That's actually what I use on my plastic spreader, so I can bend this as well and get the hardened epoxy off of the plastic spreader, the same as the tubs. So this is also reusable. I don't have a silicone spreader, but I like this plastic spreader. The one downside, I think, is it tends to scrape, quite, as I'm spreading the epoxy out, I want to be not very firm on it. I don't want to really press down hard, but just kind of let it glide along the surface. But because it's a hard edge, I don't think it does the best job if the edge is slightly curved of following those curves. It'll tend to fill in the low spots and scrape off the high spots, which might be exactly what you want. I have a feeling if I had a more flexible silicone spreader that it would do a better job of following any slight curves in the surface if I'm spreading the epoxy. And finally, if we have paper, the paper, any type of paper container that you would have, this is just a regular paper cup. But if you buy any type of specialized paper containers just for mixing epoxy, know that these are really one-time use. You use them, you mix it up, and you throw them away. The benefit of that is every time you mix up your epoxy, you're guaranteed that the inside of the container is going to be completely clean, and there's not going to be any contaminants in here from a previous use. The downside is you got to buy new paper containers all the time. But if that's not an issue and you can get inexpensive paper containers, something like this is actually even recycled paper, so it's not so bad, I think, for the environment. Okay, so that's the rundown of these three. Which one am I using? Well, I started out, I have not used the paper. I started out with these plastic containers, and I recently switched over to the silicone. And I think I like the silicone just because of the cleanup. I think I can get a better cleanup of this than I can with the plastic container, and that means that the next time I go to use this, it'll be closer to the I guess the clean state of a paper container And I don't have to worry. I think this will last forever as far as reuse. It's not going to crack or anything. So I'm leaning more towards the silicone, but I have to say that the ease of mixing and making sure I can pour every drop out of these plastic containers is really a benefit. Now, when I mix my silicone, I don't use the graduated measurements on the side. I have the pumps from West Marine that measure out the epoxy and the hardener automatically into this. So if I was measuring them out, I would probably have to go with the plastic. But since I'm not measuring them out in the container itself, and I like the cleanup and how I can get this, really clean after each use, for me, I'm going with the silicone mixing containers. All right, I hope this helps, and that'll be all. Thank you.